move forward with the next part for today's session, that is Spring Data REST. Now, Spring Data REST is basically a part of Spring Data project, which makes it easy to build the hypermedia-driven REST web services on top of the Spring Data repositories. So it basically builds on top of the Spring Data repositories and analyzes application domain and exposes the HTTP resources. If I have to mention few features of Spring Data REST for you, then I would say it exposes a discoverable REST API for your domain model. It allows you to dynamically filter collection resources. It exposes dedicated search resources for query methods. It also allows to define client-specific representations and supports JPA, MongoDB, Neo4j, Solar, Cassandra, Gemfire, and other databases. Not only this, but it also exposes the metadata about the model discovered as JSON schema and allows to dynamically filter the collection resources. Right? So guys, these are few features of Spring Data REST, but if you have to understand Spring Data REST in short, then Spring Data REST is basically used to fetch the data from the database for REST web services, right? So initially in the session, I had shown you how to fetch the data from a web application in a simple manner. But if you have to fetch the data for web services, that is the REST web services, then you have to use the Spring Data REST. So let's see how to fetch the data and how to manipulate data, right? So on that note, let me just open my Eclipse workspace again and let me just close the running processes, right? So I'll close all the files so that there's no confusion. Now for this particular hands-on, let's say we create an altogether new project, right? So for that, we go to File, we choose New, then we choose Spring Startup Project. And then what I'll do is I'll just mention the name to be, let's say, Data REST Demo. And then I'll click on Next. Once I click on Next, I'll basically choose the dependency. So obviously, since we're dealing with data, we need the H2 database dependency, we need the REST repositories, we need Spring Data JPA, and we also need the web services, right? So I'll just search for web. I'll mention Spring Web and web services, and then I'll click on Finish. So as you can see, our project has been loaded and our application file has been created. Alright, so for this particular demo, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new class, right? So over here, I'll go to New and then I'll choose Class. And over there, what I'll do is I'll mention the class name, let's say it to be Customers again. And then I'll click on Finish. Alright, now over here also, I'll again give few parameters like, customer ID, name, right? So let's just give the same. So I'll just mention private int, and let's say I mention CID. Similarly, I'll mention private string CNAME, and let's say I mention private string spelling, right? I'll mention course name, right? So for all the three of them, I'll generate the getter setter methods. So I'll right click over here, go to source, generate getter setter methods, right? I'll select all and click on generate. So I'll just copy back over here so that there's no confusion. Right now, after that, I'll just convert it to string also. So I'll again choose everything, right click, go to source, go generate to string, right? And then I'll click on generate. Now, after that, what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular section, remove from over here, and then I'll paste it back over here, right? And then I'll click on save. My bad, sorry, bracket has to go down, and then there should be one more bracket which ends, right? So this is how basically the customers class is created. Now what I want to do is I'll basically create a repository from where we'll access the data, right? So for that, what I'm going to do is I'll right click over here, go to New, choose Interface, and let's say I mention the repository's name to be Customers Repo, right? And then I click on Finish, right? Once I click on Finish, I'll basically extend it to the JPA repository. So I'll mention JPA repository, and then I have to mention two values, that is basically the customers class and integer, right? So I'll just import this to our official JPA repository. That is basically I'll just import the required annotation. Now our basic agenda is to find out, in all our previous demos, we had controllers. What was happening was that, we were creating JSP files where that was the view. And then we had the controller where we defined the URLs on what parameters, what should be returned or not. But in this scenario, we do not have any controller, right? So do you think our REST repositories are so intelligent enough that, automatically they pick up the URLs? Well, I think, the REST repositories can very well do that. So to do that, what they simply have to do is you have to use the @REST repository annotation, right? So what I'll mention over here is repository REST resource. Okay, I'm sorry, there's a spelling mistake, right? And then I'll just import the @REST repository annotation. And over there, what I'll basically do is I'll basically mention the collection resource URLs to be customers and then the path to be also customers, right? So basically we are trying to mention our resource URL and from where the data has to be extracted, right? I'll mention path equal to customers, right? So all our URLs will be working on the path customers. And then what I'll do is I'll just save this particular section and then I'll just relaunch the specific project. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm launching the other project. Let me just cancel the execution. And what I'll do is I'll basically run it for the first time. So I'll just go over here, run as, and then choose Spring Boot app. All right, now we see an error that 55 common frames omitted, and then there's an error regarding our data. So that was basically, we've not given any file from where data can be retrieved, right? So that is a main problem over here. And also we have not configured our H2 database, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'll just stop this execution over here, right? And now what I'll do is I'll go back. I'll go to the application properties file. Let's say I change the port number to be 8085 and then I've enabled the H2 database and the data source platform is H2 and our database name is list of customers, right? Now after that, basically I'm just going to use a SQL file to make sure that the data is getting automatically entered, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my project and over here I'll create a new file. So I'll go to other, I'll search for SQL and then I'll click on next. Let's say I mentioned the SQL's name to be sample.sql and then I click on finish. Right now, once I click on finish, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click over here. I'll choose open with and I'll choose SQL editor. I'll open the file with SQL query editor and then I'll just mention the queries. So I'll just mention insert into customers values and in brackets, I'll mention one, the name to be Sahiti, right? And the email address will be sahiti@edureka.co. Now similarly I have to do for the other 4 queries also. So let me just copy paste them, right? And then I'll change the number. So I'll change it to 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And I'll just change the name. I'm changing the email address also. Right now, once this is done, what I'll do is I'll just save this particular file and then I'll relaunch this particular application again. So I'll go to relaunch option and choose data res demo and then let's just launch this application. As we can see, there are a lot of errors and our application is not starting. This is basically because we forgot to initialize the table, right? So we put the data, we put the code to insert the data and then we put the code to basically connect to the repository and extract the required data. But we forgot to create a table. So to create a table automatically, what we have to do is we have to use the @entity annotation, right? So I'll just mention the @entity annotation over here, right? And similarly over here, I'll mention the @ID annotation to basically mention all the field details. And then I'll mention the generated value annotation to identify the customer ID as the primary key, right? After that, I'll click on save. And now let's just relaunch the project again. So as you can see, the Tomcat has started on port number 8085, right? So what I'll do is I'll just go back to my Postman and then I'll change the port number to 8085 and then I'll choose the get method and choose customers, right? So if I choose customers, we see that our application is running, but our data has not been fetched, right? So our data has not been extracted from our SQL file. So to do that, let's just check what's wrong with our SQL file. So let me just open that once. So somehow our SQL file is not working. So what we can simply do is we can just copy this particular section. We can just delete this file. Now let's just relaunch the application. Right, and then we can see that it has started on port 8085. So before I go to Postman, what I'll do is I'll go to my H2 console, right? So I'll go to port number 8085, right? And then I'll just log in. Now over here, what I'll do is I'll just insert the values into the statement. So I've just copy pasted over here and then I've executed the statements, right? So I'll just copy paste and keep them at a specific place, right? And then I'll mention select star from customers. And if I run this particular statement, you can see that our database has 5 records. Now coming to the concept of Spring Data REST, we had to fetch data from database, right? So similarly, if we just use the get method and use 8085 for customers, and then if I click on send, you'll see an output of all the 5 customers with all the details like, customer name, customer email ID, and the customer ID. For example, let's say you want to delete a customer. So for that, you'll just go to delete, and let's say you want to delete the second customer, you'll just mention the customer ID and then click on send. Now, once you click on send, you can just go back to get statement again, and then we go back to the customer's URL, and then we can clearly see that, we have customer with ID 1, then with ID 3 and ID 4 and ID 5. So that means automatically the second customer has got deleted. So guys, that was about the get method and the delete method, guys. Now you can go forward and try out the post method and the put methods by yourself. With that, we come to an end to this particular section of the session, that is Spring Data REST. Now let's move forward with the next part of the session, that is Spring Security. Now, Spring Security is one of the most important module that you have to understand, since every web application that you make, you have to make sure that your web application is secure. So to make sure that the web application is secure, you have to use the Spring Security. So Spring Security is basically a highly customizable authentication and access control framework, and focuses both on authentication and authorization to Java applications. It's basically the de facto standard securing Spring-based applications, and has mainly three kinds of security models, that is the Spring Security Kerberos, Spring Security Auth, and Spring Security SAML. So I'm not going to go into depth of each one of them one by one, but yes, I am going to show you how you can secure your applications using Spring Boot. So without any further ado, let's take a look at how to secure applications using Spring Boot. For that, I'll just switch back to my Eclipse workspace, right? I'll just close all the tabs. So let me just close all the tabs. To secure your applications using Spring Security, we need a web application, right? So for that, let's just create a new project altogether. So I'll just choose File, New Spring Starter Project, and I'll just mention Secure Example, right? And then I'll click on Next. Once I click on Next, I'll just choose Spring Security, Spring Web, and Web Services, and then I'll click on Finish. Now, once I click on Finish, you can see that, automatically my project has got loaded. It just has one file, that is the application.java, that is the main class file. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to first create a web application, and then I'll show you how you can secure that application, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to resources over here, and in templates, what I'll do is I'll create new files, right? So over here, I want to create an HTML file. So I'll just search for HTML, right? I'll click on next. And let's say we have our first file, which is home.html, right? I'll click on finish, and then you can automatically see that, this particular file is loaded up. So I'm just going to copy paste the code over here. So don't worry, I'll be explaining you what I'm doing over here. So basically, whenever we have the URL of home, so according to our web application, this is what we want to load when the home.html is requested as response, right? So it will display an output, welcome to Edureka. It has a background color, and then it will say click @Edureka. That is basically, it's calling the Edureka page. That is the different HTML page that we have not created yet. So over here, we'll basically ask the user to log in, right? So this is like the first page of our web application, where we'll see welcome to Edureka and click here to log in. Once that person clicks there to log in, the person will enter the username and password, and if the username and password is valid, he'll go and see the next page. Otherwise, it will display an output saying that, invalid username and password. So that was about the home.html page, guys. Now let's move forward with the next page, that is the Edureka page itself. So I'll again go to new over here. I'll choose other, I'll choose HTML, and then I'll click on next. Once I click on next, I'll just mention the file name to be edureka.html, and then I'll click on finish. So this is basically the file that we want to print. Now this can be a simple file also, where you can print a hello world and then just check. Well, I'm not going to do that since we have already done that in the course of our session. But yes, I'm just going to directly mention the code for mentioning the username and the password, right? So let me just copy paste the code from here. Now coming to the edureka.html page, don't worry, it just gives a title of hello world, and then it has a background color, and then it says hello user. So whatever is the user name that we mentioned, that particular username will be printed as output over here with the help of the HTTP servlet request method. So don't worry, I'm going to show you how that's happening. And after that, what happens is that, we have created an action of logout. So once the person clicks on logout, the user is logged out of the system, right? So the input type is basically submit, and value is logout. So that was about the edureka.html page, guys. Now let's move forward with the next page, that is the login page. So the user has to log in somewhere, right? So that is basically the page that we have to create now. So that is, again, we go to new over here, and then we'll mention other. And over here, we'll choose HTML. We'll go to next. And over here, I'll mention login.html. Now, once in the login.html file, you basically have to mention the username and the password, which has to be considered as the standard username and the password, right? So over here, the title is basically Edureka example, and then I have a background color, right? After that, I've mentioned the parameters error, right? So if the username and the password are incorrect, this is basically the output that is displayed. That is the username and password mentioned are incorrect. If the user logs out, the output displayed is that, the user has been logged out. And if the user logs in, the form basically displays the customer username and password, and the input type is text for the username and type password for the password, right? So after that, we have the submit button, that is basically the login button. So I'm rushing up on this part because this is not our main part where we have to concentrate. Else we have to understand how we secure our application, right? So you can just make any web application and you can start securing it. So now, as I was telling you in the course of session also, almost all the web applications basically have the controller, right? So we have to configure the controller file for that. So what I'll do is I'll go to new over here, and let's say I configure the class name to be, let's say, controller, right? And then I'll click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, this is basically the output that you see, that is the package and the public class, right? But before I start configuring the controller class, what I want to do is I want to configure a model view controller, right? So to configure a model view controller, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new class. So I'll right click over here, go to new, and then I'll say class. And let's say we mention the class name to be MVC configurer, right? So I've just mentioned the name to be model view configurer, and then I'll click on finish, right? So I'll basically copy paste the code and then I'll paste it over here, right? And then the basic error that we see is basically our class name. So I'll just change it to MVC configurer, right? It basically extends the web security configurer adapter. Now in the controller class, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy paste the codes. Now over here, if you observe, what I've basically done is that I've implemented the web MVC configurer to the controller class, right? And over here, I've imported the view controller registry and also the MVC configurer, right? The add view controllers basically add 4 view controllers. 2 of the view controllers reference to the view whose name is home, that is basically which is defined by the home.html file, that is these 2. And the other 2 basically reference to the edureka and the login.html file. So that is basically the controller part, guys. So now what we've done is we've created the model, we've created the view on what the user should see, and then we've also created the controller. But yes, we have to configure our security, right? So when I say you have to configure your Spring security in the application, the Spring security basically automatically secures all the HTTP endpoints with the basic authentication. But yes, if you further want to customize the security settings, the first thing that you need to do is basically add Spring security to the class part. So that was basically the dependency file that we had already added while creating the project, right? Now, after that is done, what you basically have to do is you have to create the Spring security configuration class, which basically ensures that, only authenticated users will be redirected to a specific page. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'll just right click over here, go to new, and then what I'll do is I'll create a new class. Let's say I'll mention security configurer, and then I'll click on finish. So this is basically the class. And now what I'm going to do is I'll just copy paste the code and then I'll explain you in depth, right? So let me just copy paste the code, and over here I'll just change it to security configurer. And now if you observe over here, basically the security configurer class is annotated with the @enable web security annotation to enable Spring Security's web security support and provide the Spring MVC integration. Not only this, but it also extends to the web security configurer adapter and overrides a couple of its methods to set some specific values of the web security configuration. After that, if you come down to the code, we see configure HTTP security HTTP. Well, this method basically defines which URL paths should be secured and which should not be. So over here, if you observe, if it is slash or if it is slash home, that means that, these paths do not require any authentication. So this is basically just a home page. But when it comes to the other ones, that is the login and the edureka one, both of these URLs must be authenticated, right? So when a user successfully logs in, they will be redirected to the previously requested page that requires authentication. So there's a custom login page specified by the login page method, and everyone is allowed to view it. Coming to the user details method, well, the user details service method basically sets up an in-memory user store with single user, right? So the user is basically given the username to be edureka and the password to be edureka and the role as a user. So that was about this particular file, guys. It's really simple to understand. So for all the annotations, you have to import the required libraries that I had already done before. Now, if I come back to the login page, you can clearly see that, the time leaf template basically simply represents a form that captures the username and the password and posts them to the login URL, right? So as configured, the Spring Security basically provides a filter that intercepts that request and authenticates that particular user. So if the user fails to authenticate, then the page is redirected to the login error page. That is basically over here where it is clearly shown that the username and the password are mentioned incorrect. And if the user successfully logs into the page and after that he or she wishes to log out, that particular user is basically redirected to this particular page, that is the logout page, param.logout. So it will be /login ?logout, right? And then you'll see an output that the user has been logged out. Lastly, since we wanted to display the user's name also, for example, so if the user with the username Edureka logs in, then we need an output which says hello Edureka, right? So for that, what I'm going to do over here is that I'll go back to my Edureka page, and then you can clearly see that we've used the http servlet.remote user method to basically integrate that we display the username of Spring Security's integration with this particular method. Apart from that, the logout form basically submits a post method to logout, that is the /logout URL, and upon successfully logging out, it will redirect the user to /login ?logout. So guys, that was about all the files together. Now, if I have to just give you an overview, then you can see that we have a home page where we are saying welcome to Edureka, and then we want to log in, right? So we give an option over there, click here to log in. Once the user clicks on the link, he'll be redirected to a different page, that is /Edureka, where the user has to log in with the username and the password. Now the username and the password for the valid user has been mentioned in the code itself, where we've used the user details service. So any other user with other username and password who tries to log in will basically face an error, and the message will be displayed as invalid username and password. But yes, if the user successfully logs in, then he'll be redirected to the third page which says that hello and then the username. So let's see what happens. So over here, before I move forward, I'll just configure the port. Let's say server.port equal to 8083. Right after that, what I'll do is I'll just execute this particular project. So let's just relaunch the application. Now, as you can see, the application is starting. So now what we can do is we can go back to our localhost port 8083. And then if I pass a URL /home, you see welcome to Edureka, and then you see a message. Click here to see a login, right? So over here, I'll just click there, and then we'll mention the customer username and password. So over here, if I just mention Sahiti, and then if I mention the password to be Edureka, what happens is that if I click on login, we'll be basically redirected to the login error page where it says that the customer username and password mentioned are incorrect. Now, if I just mention the correct password, that is Edureka, and the username to be Edureka, and then if I click on login, you can clearly see that we get redirected to localhost :8083/Edureka, where we say hello Edureka, right? And then we have an option of logout, so the user can very well go and log out. So guys, this was a simple demo on how you can secure your application. So over here, I was trying to secure the application based on the user's login. Well, there are various ways to secure your application.